Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome, everyone. So this is We the People, building and engaging movements. And since there are a lot of us on stage, we're just going to sort of go down and say who we are, what we do, and sort of why we're relevant to the topic at hand, and then we'll get into it. So, Farhaan, you want to start?
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, everyone, for being here. My name is Farhaan Ladhani. I'm the CEO of a tech company called Perennial that is building a platform to accelerate citizen participation in civic action. We learn a lot of what we learn from experiments that we run in the international space to open platforms for free expression in closed and information-restricted societies.
I'm Erica Chenoweth. I'm a professor at the University of Denver in the US, and I have a database of all mass movements from around the world from 1900 through the present, and I do research trying to understand what makes these movements succeed and fail.
Hi, my name is Valentin. I'm one of the co-founders of Open Source Politics, which is the French startup implementing solutions, civic technology, tools, platforms for institutions, companies, and movements.
Hi, everyone. I'm Keyvan. I'm from Switzerland, running a foundation called Act on Your Future, and the idea is to fostering civic engagement among the next generation of young professionals by changing the way they understand human rights and engage in social causes. So we're working with high school students, young artists, art galleries, auction houses, private banks to engage the different audiences of clients, employees, and shareholders around philanthropy, human rights, and social causes.
Nice. My name is Kleinhenz, one of the co-founders of UptoUs, and we focus on creating coalitions in marginalized communities within different organizations of the communities themselves to create a larger movement.
Cool. So we have some, people who study movements, people who are more applied in the sense of building movements. And one thing that we were sort of talking about just a minute ago was the metrics that both Farhaan and Erica use to gauge whether movements have been or will be successful, and whether those things kind of apply to the work that you guys do on the ground. So so you have 3 and you have 4. Do you want to just run through those so we can use them as guideposts to...
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, happy to. So we've established 3 characteristics of successful movements. And I'll start by saying that I think that tech-fueled movements, particularly in the last 6 to 8 years, have failed. And it's because of one of these 3 characteristics. The first is momentum. And I think there, technology really helps at generating opportunities to get lots of people involved and having those movements grow. And our current tech platforms help us do that. The second is being able to take that momentum, translate it into acquiring and wielding political power, so you can disrupt the status quo and maybe even provide an alternative. And I think there as well, new advocacy efforts fueled by tech have been helpful. The third, where I think it's failed, is at actually making movements totally distributed. And if we look at movements of the past that have been successful, distribution is a key component of giving people the agency to act on their own and in concert. And I think that's where technology's failed us today.
So distribution of power would be the...
Distribution of power and distribution of opportunity. People taking opportunities to participate on their own terms and growing into locuses of power in their own right.
Okay. And so then to what extent does that overlap with your 4 metrics?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're broadly consistent with the ones that come out of the data that I mentioned. The first major component of successful movements is mass participation. Participation both in terms of the quantity of people participating and in terms of the quality of the kind of diversity of the movement. The reason that matters is because the opponent is not monolithic, and there are many people who work in different pillars of support, for example, economic elites, business elites, security forces, state media, and others, who a large and diverse movement can access and put pressure on to shift their level of cooperation. The third metric is that movements that succeed tend to have flexible methods. They don't just focus on protest or demonstrations, but they shift from those to more kind of non-cooperation methods like strikes or boycotts or no-shows. And those can be extremely disruptive and impose real and immediate costs on the opponent. And then the fourth metric is that the movements maintain nonviolent discipline when they are repressed or when repression escalates. That shows that the movement has real staying power. And we know from these data that the average nonviolent campaign takes about 3 years to run its course, meaning that the movement has to have the wherewithal and capacity to keep a very diverse coalition of actors involved and, in fact, escalate their involvement. But one thing that really is interesting that comes out of the data is that no mass movement has ever failed after mobilizing 3.5% of the population. So it sounds like a small number, but in fact, in the US today, that would be like 11.5 million people. So if 11.5 million people engaged in different forms of non-cooperation, protests, and civil disobedience for 3 years, you can imagine things would look different in the country. This is a series of metrics that we can use to gauge whether a movement is on its way to success.
And when you talk about mass movements and the opponent, it tends to be a mass movement rising up against a repressive state. Is that kind of the core case that you work with, or?
The data that I referred to before is focused on those kind of maximalist campaigns of opposing a state, but I've also done research on movements opposing corporations and different types of policies or systems, and the same four metrics really pop out as being influential in those cases as well.
And so then for you guys who are involved, I mean, some of your stuff is more local, as we've been talking about, rather than, broad state-based. And maybe less, maybe you're doing more state-based stuff. But do you see that in terms of, momentum being easier to gather than to sustain? Do you see the sort of challenge of diversifying being a limiting step?
Basically, we all started with the idea that using internet and civic tools online will help make the momentum and massify the engagement and But in fact, it's not working like that. If you want to have a diverse movement, you need to focus on the people that will not show up. And they will not show up online because technology is hard for some people to get involved in. And so if you want to build a real movement using technology, you really have to focus on education, focus on mobilization on the field of all the actors that will help your movement spread to every part of the society. And I think it's really the lesson that we have learned in several local or national consultation, participatory budgeting projects, and they are not aiming to really change the regime or just making people more active in the political life and the civic life. But the same rules apply. If you want to connect with a more diverse population, you have to put some effort on reaching them and helping them just to have access and use the tools.
Well, so maybe we should talk, Anne, maybe you can talk a little bit about Standing Rock, because we're talking about general principles and how they apply to specific cases. And so maybe by using Standing Rock as an example of, a pretty localized movement that has, national and global consequences, we can see, which parts of these elements were successful and which parts were not successful. Like, how did you see all of these stages of building momentum, whether the movement was able to diversify and have staying power or not, and what the factors were in that case?
Well, Standing Rock, when it started, was more of a protest than a movement, because it really was very late on. So when you were saying 3 years, that definitely didn't happen. It was a 6 months time period. But what came out of it, and what it has become a global movement, is the divestment movement. It's the divestment movement from banks, from Seattle divesting, cities divesting, and different countries starting to hold their political powers and their corporations accountable where they invest their money into and what they're doing. So I think in that part, we gained momentum very slowly in the beginning, and then hit a tipping point, and everybody was talking about it, it seemed. But out of that, luckily, came some really good asks and policies and things that people focus on versus just protesting. And I think in this social media age, what happens a lot is we have a hashtag and it trends and it's fun, and you have the memes, or you have the instantaneous ice bucket challenge, but are these guys then invested into the movement afterwards? So we have donors and volunteers, but we don't have investors into a long-term movement a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And and I think part of it is because there's the groups that run awareness campaigns, which are great and needed in an educational aspect, and then there's the political organizers. They don't always work together, and sometimes they're conflicting. So I think movements, or trends or aspiring movements fall apart because they're not diversified even from the actors within.
Well, maybe, I mean, just it sounds pretty simple, but I think it would be really useful to define what a movement is or is not. You were saying the difference between a protest and a movement, you know, and we're in a moment where everything is a movement. You know, my new album is going to be a movement. You know, like that word gets thrown around a lot. You know, what is a movement by your lights? But you know, is there kind of like a standard academic definition of it? Is there a standard activist definition of it?
You know, I'm happy to come in here. I don't know about a standard academic definition, but I think that what we ought to be doing is viewing movements as the interests of many people colliding over a period of time, where the collision of those interests can produce really significant change. We've seen that significant change take place. But I think the challenge has been that we've viewed movements as these monolithic enterprises, that everyone's out for one objective, and frankly, that's a time-bound objective. So in the context of Egypt, it was to bring Mubarak down. That's great. What happens the next day? That's just one transaction that's necessary across many, many transactions that need to take place to actually build new institutions. So in the case of Egypt, it was great. You had that one transaction, broke the existing institution, and then the movement fell apart. And as a result, they weren't able to establish enduring change. And I think that's the failure of movements, is this inability to establish enduring change, because keeping those interests constantly colliding from individual people is a necessary component to actually generating the kind of impact that they sought in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
I would just add that in academic terms, usually people consider movements kind of organizational entities that engage in sustained collective action. And a movement can do collective action that's largely institutionalized, like advocacy work, legal work, lobbying government officials, and so forth, within kind of the legal framework of the society. Or they can engage in extra institutional action, which is breaking a law and engaging in transgressive actions like civil disobedience. And largely the movements that I focus on are the latter. It's illegal to engage in direct opposition to the government, and so they're completely organized outside of the sort of approved channels of political influence. And in fact, that can be extremely disruptive just by the nature of breaking a law and forcing the opponent to respond and expend resources in responding.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned before the resistance, the U.S. resistance. What do we think about calling something like a resistance a movement? I mean, you mentioned a movement that doesn't have a specific goal beyond resistance to the current regime. What does everybody think about, using that as a first order of business, first resist, without really a consensus on what the second or third order of business is?
Well, I think what happens is that you can get disruption that way. You can topple a regime, but you can't necessarily put something better in its place. Mm-hmm. Or it can actually become much worse in the society. So one of the things that I've done some work on is trying to predict which types of movements end up creating more stable and democratic regimes in the aftermath of success. And it does turn out that if the movement succeeds by forcing a negotiation or forcing kind of electoral processes to come into play, they're much more likely to result in these sort of long-term democratic and stable outcomes than if they just, assassinate the leader and take over in a coup, in which case you're much more likely to get just a retelling of the sort of martial values and authoritarian process in very hierarchical societies. And a lot of other people have done research that's shown this general trend as well.
Mm-hmm. I think I'll just add to that by saying I think the risk of focusing only on the first order of business is that the second order of business has a lower likelihood of success then. And so what the ultimate objective is actually really matters. Mm-hmm. And it's not necessarily going to be the same for everybody. And so while people's interests will come together to get the first order of business, get rid of that particular regime, if you don't have a process by which you can then channel that energy that had them participate in the first place to come back the next day and actually start building those new institutions, I think you end up with the scenario that you just articulated, which is maybe worse off than where you started.
Got it.
Yeah, I think also with the resistance movement, because it's being called that, it's not really movement, it's more a trend, and it was because people were really angry and people were protesting and wanting to let that anger out, but there was no real ask. So for me, that was really lacking. So when we're talking about what defines a movement, it's lacking that. It's lacking the solution part. It's lacking the what actions can you take directly that will make a change. Within the hashtag resistance, you know, the persistence is missing that you were mentioning earlier. And it also, it had a counter effect of then people kept showing up to protest, and then they became really tired and going, well, nothing's making a difference. I was told within 100 days we could impeach him, which was crazy to even have mentioned, because we know it doesn't work like that. So there's a lot of PR being spun around that, and there was a lot capitalized on that angle where a lot of people made a lot of money from it, where the news is still making money from it. And I think we also have to look at why we want to do a movement and what is the goal under it. So it's not just, like you were saying, it's not just this one little thing that we have to address. We have to address a much broader, we have to engage in a much broader conversation as what we actually want as human beings, and do we have that right now? And in a lot of places we don't. You know, and then we have to look at how do we build that sustainably, how we build that ethically, and how can we form those coalitions to come together and create a long-lasting impact and come up with real solutions.
I think what is also interesting is it's this question that always comes back, like, for example, in European countries that are, for most of them, doing quite well. Do you need a crisis to have a successful movement or not? And maybe that will be interesting to, like, fighting a regime because there is a big problem. And can we also have some movements that are based on, like, that are happening in societies that are not so going bad, like basically everything is okay, but you want to start a movement on a more global issue, like for climate change or something like that. And for example, I think, Keyvan, that's what you try to do with human rights and developing the ability in every citizen to just show up and fight for something.
Yeah, I guess, exactly. I mean, the question, if you don't resist against a common threat, what brings you together? And obviously, for us at Human Rights Watch in Geneva, more particularly, is finding the common values and principles that bring people together. And for us, human rights are those values, guiding principles that should be commonly shared and respected by everyone. And obviously, it's less powerful as a mean to create strong commitments toward a common goal and set milestones. Obviously, the time frame is long term, and obviously is also less interesting, so to say, for many or many people, because they tend to react only when there's a sense of urgency. And when you talk about human rights, civic engagements, it tends to come in the second or third position for people in Switzerland and in other countries in Europe. So it's interesting to see that there's, although many differences that differentiate us from people in Egypt and Ukraine and the Occupy movement in the US. But then on the other hand, is for us also to find ways to bring them together around those common causes and give them also meaning to then show them how they can implement that in their daily lives.
Well, and one thing that seems like is not present in that case is the thing that Erica mentioned a few times, which is the opponent. You know, when you have an opponent, you have, you know, stop this pipeline from being built, stop this, you know, president's agenda, topple this dictator. Human rights doesn't necessarily have one clearly defined opponent, and climate change might have a similar problem. And so does anybody have sort of advice for movement building when there isn't a clear opponent and yet the threat is there?
But I mean, just to talk about human rights, like one of the examples of our program we organize is a photography competition, and each year we change topic. One of the topic being last year was the refugee crisis in Europe, and it was difficult. I mean, everyone was confronted with it, more or less, but everyone felt concerns about the topic. And I think giving them an opportunity to be able to express themselves about the topic was, in this case, particularly young artists to produce a socially engaged work and then organize a collective exhibition. I think that was important, like a mean for them to communicate and express themselves. Today, this year, the topic of our competition is the rise of populism. And obviously, although it's not a direct threat to our democracies in Switzerland, at least, it's something that everyone feels worry about. And I think how we engage is basically offering them an opportunity, a platform to express themselves and bring different audiences together around the common causes.
You could call it "We the People." Your populism. Yeah. What were you saying?
Well, I was going to say that the civil rights leader Vincent Harding used to say that I'm a citizen of a country that doesn't yet exist. And a huge part of movement success in the longer term is devoting significant resources during the most disruptive phases of the movement even to trying to promote that alternative that you're trying to realize. For example, the Women's March on Washington last year was just called the Women's March on Washington. The March on Washington that Martin Luther King was part of was actually called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. So it was for something, not just against something. And the civil rights movement, people that were involved in that met every single morning at like 5:30 in the morning, even college students, to talk about the type of society they were trying to create. So Gandhi called this constructive program. Lots of people today call this developing alternative institutions or alternative systems, but some resources have to be devoted to that in order to really create the sustainable change.
A positive vision. So I want to talk about one more thing, and then we're going to do a Q&A in a few minutes, so think of your questions. The last thing I want to make sure we touch on is, I think we're moving a little bit beyond the moment of being either fully derisive of technology's role in movements or fully, blindly sort of enthusiastic about it. There was sort of a time when you were either just, hashtags are meaningless or hashtags are going to save the world. And I think we're in a little bit more of a nuanced place now. Can someone speak to the notion of how technology can be one tool in movement building that isn't all to the good or all to the bad?
I can, yeah.
I mean, the technology is a tool, so every tool can be used for a good purpose or a bad purpose. But I think the positive side of technology is that we can connect much more instantaneously, and I can connect with somebody across the world, and I don't have to be in the same room, and I can share messages, and I can share what's going on in my part of the world. So as far as coalition building goes, we haven't done that. Some movements have done it, the peasant movement, and Brazil has done it, and the peasant movement across the world has done it, which is not talked about a lot, where they're reoccupying farmlands. So there is global movements, and they use technology very well. I think what sometimes happens as people that only tech is enough, so only online doesn't work, and again, it's then not a diverse movement. You need the keyboard warriors for sure, but there's also the people on the streets, and it's not always the glorious work. It's the meeting at 5 in the morning, it's the going to bed at 2 in the morning. That still has to happen, and we can alleviate some of that by technology, because I don't have to drive to your house anymore. I can get on a phone call, but you still need the human component. And I just want to clarify something about Egypt. I don't think the movement fell apart so much as the movement was squashed, and there's a lot of people in jail because of it. So I just want to clarify that for people that aren't familiar with it. Well, Occupy, you can say, maybe fell apart because there wasn't a direct ask and people didn't really know what to do. I think Egypt is a little bit different, so I just want to clarify.
I'd like to come on the technology question. Look, I think that we vacillate between a dystopic view and a utopian view of technology, like you alluded to. I think that in the 1700s we had canals, in the 1800s and 1900s we had roads and bridges, and these were all intended to connect people. And today we have bits and bytes that are intended to do the same thing. It's what we do with the infrastructure that actually matters. And so I don't think the infrastructure is the problem. I think it's how we leverage the infrastructure. And so when we look at technology, I think we need to recognize its successes and its failures. And if you do a diagnostic on the stuff that it's good at and where the deficiencies are, it becomes pretty clear that it does some things really well today. It allows you to generate visibility and reach like you've never been able to generate before. It gives you opportunities to take that visibility and reach and direct it towards a specific objective. But where it's failed, I think, is taking that one objective and turning it into 100 objectives and 1,000 objectives that still allows you to meet that collective intent that brought people there in the first place. And that technology piece, I think, is frankly missing. And I think it's led to where we are today because of the dissatisfaction. And I think that Anne and Erica both spoke about this, the dissatisfaction that people have with, clicking a like. Because no number of likes is going to feed people in Syria, and no number of likes is going to produce the type of enduring change, but it's one part, not the solution.
Yep. Got it.
I just wanted to add on this issue of the tools that there are different dynamics in the creation of the tools and different purpose of the tools. And if the name of my company is Open Source Politics, is because we do believe that it's in creating open source and free software that we can spread all this knowledge and use of the tools. And for example, what we do is basically we use tools that were developed in Argentina, for example, Democracy OS, tools that were built in Madrid, in Barcelona, and we provide our knowledge of these tools to local institutions in France, so they don't have to reinvent the wheel and recreate from scratch a new tool, because it already exists. What is the difference is how you use the tool and how you use it for good, and how you can put more effort on going to the streets, going to the public you want to engage with the tool. So creating digital commons using open source software is a way to spread all the methodology and really to lower the access and the barrier for more movements to start on their own and not depending on tools that they don't control.
Just one thing to add, when we talk about new technologies and then on the other hand social movements, for me I see a paradox, because obviously when the time frame with new technologies is instantaneously and it's all like straight ahead there with very strong emotions and people react wherever you are based in the world basically, whereas social movements change don't happen overnight, and it takes usually years to see concrete results, and Egypt is definitely one of those examples where it's not because several millions of people came down to the streets thanks to Facebook that certainly there will be regime change overnight. And again, we need to understand that although it is a very powerful tool, it needs then so many other structures and organizations for the change to happen.
So I have a question. If someone in the audience has a question, you should go first. Just let me know. Okay. I have a question while you're gathering your thoughts, but you only have a couple minutes, so get your gears turning. Whether there's a way for us to know whether there's a kind of net widening or net narrowing effect of online activism, by which I mean, if you're just going to click a like versus showing up, if you're just going to check in at Standing Rock versus showing up at Standing Rock, we know which one would have a greater effect on the movement. On the other hand, if you're only going to check in on Facebook versus do nothing, then that's a net positive. So I wonder if we have a way of measuring whether online activism, which baseline we should measure against.
I use oftenly I don't know if you know Audrey Tang. She's the digital minister in Taiwan, and she was one of the leaders of Sunflower Revolution a couple of years ago. And she had with her a bunch of some geeks, like they were creating softwares. And she made a graph, starting with a like on Facebook, really at the bottom of the graph, and then it's increased up to creating your own movement. And so there are several steps. You like, then you share content, then you comment, and then you go on the street and speak, for example. And then you get elected, and then you start your own movement or something like that. So basically, the point is nobody starts on the top of the graph. Everyone started with a like, with being interested in some topic. Yeah. The idea is how we can help other people to move up on the
Facebook
graph.
like as a gateway drug. I like that.
Yeah, it's better than nothing, but you have to follow up with something else.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that's a downside for online activism is that it can sometimes create caricatures of what makes for an effective movement. For example, many people associate movements today with just hitting the streets. But protest and demonstration is important symbolically and to kind of assemble mass in a particular point in time, but it's also very likely to then lead to really high risk of exposure to the worst types of repression. Getting everybody in one place at the same time over and over again is what the Syria story is. But another thing is just that it kind of gives people the impression that you do most of your organizing and your political work in the streets, when actually, if you talk to activists that were involved in movements before the internet, or even at the beginning of the internet time, they'll say that 95% of what they did was meeting, coordinating, training, developing a plan, and only 5% of their time was spent in actions, right? So I think that sometimes it kind of feeds into these narratives, these kind of unsophisticated narratives about what makes a movement work. And because of that, there's less kind of capacity to create sustainable movement.
Got it. Okay, we have a question over here. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. This is not really a normative question. This is one of curiosity. Erica, correct? Who was talking about open source, intercommons, yes. I wonder what movements can learn about design from the internet. We're talking about a commons on the internet, and net neutrality has kind of pushed for that, but we're not talking about a commons in governance. And so what can we learn from that in terms of design thinking?
I think there are several things. First, we have a lot to learn in the political field from the way we create softwares, for example, because most of the time it's a community behind the software, and it is really kind of iterative process. You start something, you know if it's working or not, and then you change it until it's working for the most part of the population. And I think a political movement has to do the same, like really evolving every time and asking itself if it's most effective like this. And the way you can be sure your movement is effective is to have concrete feedback every time from people, and to start like to listen to what the people want in order to answer, like really make them a part of the creation of the movement at every time. And it's the way we design software, it's the way we should design movements. And the other thing is we had a debate on how open you have to be when you create a movement, and there is of course a risk in being too open, but that's also what we can learn from developing open source software, is that the more you spread your technology, the more chance you have to improve it and to really have the best tool possible. So that would be, some guidelines that you have to be a designer if you want to start a new political movement, I think, and really to listen to what users and other activists will have to advise. Yeah.
Yeah. Another question here. Yeah.
Sort of took on what I was trying to accomplish is nowadays it seems like the language of movements, is much one of either online presence or physical demonstrations on the street. But it seems like such an old language, like 50 years old. It's the same thing, you know. I'm from Brazil. I've seen every day. It's like, is that all that we can do, you know? And on the other hand, how can we prevent movements from becoming instrumentalized or having those masses be the support base for some kind of crazy political leaders on whichever end of the spectrum or center of the spectrum or whatever?
Yeah. So to your first question, there's an interesting study by Gene Sharp that he identified 198 methods of nonviolent action. Protest is one category of those, but honestly, there are probably thousands of methods at this point. He wrote that list in 1973. So that's easy to find online if you're curious about the incredible diversity of methods available to movements, and more are being created every day. But in terms of your second question, how do we prevent movements from being instrumentalized or co-opted by like bad actors? It's very difficult. I think a lot of different authoritarian leaders or semi-authoritarian regimes have caught on to the fact that if you get a lot of people in the streets and take great photos of it, it makes you look more legitimate. So the key question for movements is how do you outnumber them? And how do you use smarter, more appealing methods that actually send a more hopeful or resonant message to the population? I think that's one of the different tools that different dictators have tried to use, and with limited success in some cases, but it doesn't necessarily mean the end of the success of mass mobilization.
Cool. And we have just a very quick last one. You want to just do a lightning round? You had a question in the red.
Also on the subject of being co-opted, I work for a big UN agency, and previously I've worked for lots of big established NGOs, and we're acutely conscious of not co-opting movements. So I'm particularly asking Erica, but I suppose all of you, from your research, your knowledge and understanding of what is the most positive contribution a big established member of civil society or an NGO can make that isn't destructive and doesn't co-opt?
Yeah, I mean, I think that engaging with one's counterparts directly, so having NGOs work with other NGOs or having state or intergovernmental organizations engage with their counterparts is the least likely to have damaging effects on movements. If you're mitigating repression, creating opportunities for defection within the opponent regime and things like that. The best thing for movements is to engage with other movements. So transnational solidarity networks and other kind of civil society organizations that are less formalized, that are less likely to be co-opted by the states.
All right.
Can I add something to that? Just that I think large organizations also have an opportunity to provide positive impact on the environmental effects. And so what do I mean by that? It's calling out state actors who are repressing citizens and movements for the actions that they're taking, creating an ecosystem and an environment where movements have a better leg up than they otherwise would. And I think that the role of large organizations is significant here. And so it's not about interacting with the movement, but provide an ecosystem that gives a movement a better chance of success by pushing back against state actors that are seeking to reduce that effectiveness.
Cool. That's all we have time for. Thanks, guys. Thanks to all of you.
Thanks.
All right.